The wind hit at 300 miles per hour. Not a gust. Not a roar. A wall. Where the nose of the aircraft had been, where the bombardier had been sitting just seconds before, there was now nothing. Just open sky. A gaping wound of aluminum and wiring and frozen air where the front of the plane used to exist. The pilots couldn't see forward. They couldn't communicate. Half their instruments were gone. The controls were bare cables, literal wires in their hands, and the aircraft was still flying. 10 minutes. That's how long they had to keep it in the air. 10 minutes over Nazi Germany, with a dead crew member, a shattered cockpit, and nothing between them and 25,000 feet of open sky, but their own will to survive. This is not a story about a perfect mission. This is a story about what happens when everything that can go wrong does, and the men who refuse to die anyway. To understand what happened over the skies of Europe in the autumn of 1943, you have to understand what it meant to climb into a B-17 flying fortress and point it east. The Boeing B-17 was the backbone of the United States Army Air Force's strategic bombing campaign. It was a machine built for punishment, for Wright R. 1820 Cyclone engines, a 10-man crew, 13.50 caliber machine guns bristling from every angle like the quills of some enormous steel animal. It could fly at 35,000 feet, high enough that the men inside needed oxygen masks just to breathe, and it could absorb a staggering amount of damage and still bring its crew home. That was the reputation anyway. The reality was more complicated, more brutal, more honest. By mid-1943, the 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging men and machines at a rate that bordered on the catastrophic. The strategic bombing campaign, the Grand Allied theory that precision daylight bombing could destroy the industrial heart of the Third Reich and shorten the war, was proving more expensive than anyone had publicly admitted. Escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolts of the period, simply didn't have the range to accompany the bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany. The moment the escorts turned back, the B-17 formations flew on alone, and the Luftwaffe knew exactly when that happened. The German fighter pilots called the American heavy bombers Wehrmacht 4 engines, and they had developed precise, cold, lethal tactics for killing them. Head-on attacks, 12 o'clock level, coming in at closing speeds of over 500 miles per hour, firing their cannons until the last possible instant before pulling away into a split S. A B-17 struck from the front had almost no protection. The nose, that long, tapered greenhouse of plexiglass and aluminum at the aircraft's tip, housed the bombardier, who lay prone over his Norden bomb site during the bomb run, and the navigator, who kept the crew's position and time over target. The nose guns were .50 caliber machines, powerful enough, but a single fighter pilot willing to accept the risk of a head-on pass could close the distance before a gunner could even fully track him. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force suffered its worst losses of the entire war. The raids on Schweinfurt, on Münster, on Bremen. The names became synonymous not with victory but with grief. The loss rate on some missions exceeded 20%. Do the math. Fly 5 missions, and statistically, you were more likely to be dead or a prisoner of war than still flying. The men who climbed into these aircraft knew the numbers. They knew the odds. They went anyway, because they had to, because someone had to. The 100th Bombardment Group was based at Thorpe Abbotts in Norfolk, England. By late 1943, they had acquired a name that followed them like a ghost. The Bloody 100th. It was not a name they chose. It was a name earned in fire and loss, in mission after mission, where their formations seemed to take catastrophic hits, where the attrition rate climbed beyond what the statistical models could explain, where men who had been laughing in the mess hall that morning were simply gone by afternoon. Among the crews who flew from Thorpe Abbotts were men drawn from every corner of America. Farm boys from Kansas, factory workers from Pittsburgh, college students from California, who had barely finished their freshman year before the war swallowed them whole. They came together through the rigid alchemy of military necessity. 10 strangers who had to become something close to family in a matter of weeks, because in the air, what bound them was not friendship, but absolute mutual dependence. A B-17 crew was an organism. The pilot and co-pilot shared the cockpit. The navigator and bombardier occupied the nose. The flight engineer and top turret gunner stood just behind the cockpit. The radio operator sat aft, surrounded by his equipment. The ball turret gunner curled inside a sphere beneath the aircraft's belly, barely able to move. The two waist gunners stood at open windows in the fuselage, exposed to temperatures that could reach 60 degrees below zero. The tail gunner crouched at the very end of the aircraft, facing backward, watching the sky for fighters coming from behind. 10 men, 1 machine, 1 mission. And on a clear, bitterly cold morning in the fall of 1943, one of those crews climbed into their aircraft, pulled their oxygen masks tight, and began to roll down the runway at Thorpe Abbotts without the slightest premonition that they were about to be tested in a way that no training, no briefing, no survival manual had ever prepared them for. The formation assembled over England in the pre-dawn darkness, hundreds of aircraft climbing through the overcast in careful sequence, each one trusting that the others were where they were supposed to be, trusting radar and instruments and the mathematics of formation, flying not to collide in the gray murk above the channel. When the sun came up, it illuminated a sight of terrible beauty. Hundreds of B-17s in combat box formations, their contrails streaming white against the blue-black of the upper atmosphere, the whole assembly spreading across miles of sky like a slow-moving storm front made of steel and intention. Men on the ground in occupied Europe who looked up and saw this sight knew what it meant. The Americans were going to work. The target that day was deep in Germany. The specific mission, the specific crew. What matters is not the exact name or date, but the pattern, the shape of what was about to happen, because it happened again and again to crews across the 8th Air Force, and it is the truth of what these men endured that we must understand. They flew east across the Channel, then over the Dutch coast, the flak beginning almost immediately, black puffs of smoke appearing in clusters around the formation as the German anti-aircraft batteries below tracked them with radar-guided guns. The flak was a constant, unavoidable torment. You couldn't outmaneuver it during the bomb run. You couldn't do anything about it. You flew through it, and you either came out the other side or you didn't. And the men had learned, over weeks of missions, a kind of grim acceptance of that helplessness that bordered on philosophical. But it was the fighters they feared most. The Focke-Wulf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s of the Luftwaffe began appearing as the formation crossed into German airspace. They came in waves, organized, disciplined, pilots who had been flying combat since 1939 and who knew exactly how to kill a heavy bomber. They worked the edges of the formation first, picking off stragglers, any aircraft that had fallen behind due to mechanical problems or battle damage. Fall out of formation in a B-17, and you were, in the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat, almost certainly finished. The crew of the aircraft in question was flying in the high element, not the lead ship, not the last, but somewhere in the middle of the formation where the relative protection of mass defensive fire from other B-17s offered at least the illusion of safety. The gunners were at their stations. The ball turret gunner had his cramp sphere rotating as he tracked targets below. The waist gunners were firing in short, controlled bursts, their spent casings ringing off the aluminum floor. The tail gunner called out fighters at 6 o'clock high. The bombardier, lying prone in the nose over the Norden site, was focused on the target run. They were minutes from the IP, the initial point, where the aircraft would commit to the bomb run and the autopilot would be coupled to the bomb site. The human pilot essentially surrendering control of the aircraft to the precision mechanism beneath the bombardier's hands. During the bomb run, the B-17 flew straight and level. No evasive action, no deviation. The flak below burst in precise, terrible clusters, the German gunners having bracketed the formation's altitude and heading with awful accuracy. Nobody knew the fighter was coming. That was always how it happened. In the noise and chaos of aerial combat, with gunners scanning their sectors, with smoke and fire and the constant thunder of engines and guns, the human eye could miss things. The brain, overwhelmed with threat information, sometimes failed to process what it was seeing until it was too late. The Focke-Wulf came in from 12 o'clock level. High closing speed. The pilot had committed, had pointed his aircraft like a bullet at the nose of the B-17, and he was firing. His 20mm cannons and 7.92mm machine guns all hammering simultaneously, a concentrated stream of destruction that converged on the plexiglass nose of the American bomber. What happened in the next fraction of a second was not survivable. Not for the bombardier. The shell struck the nose of the B-17 with a force that was not merely destructive, but annihilating. The plexiglass greenhouse simply ceased to exist. The aluminum framework was peeled back and torn away. The nose guns, their mounts, the Norden bomb sight, the equipment racks, all of it was consumed in a catastrophic instant of kinetic violence that sent shrapnel howling backward through the aircraft. The bombardier was killed instantly. And then the wind came in. There are things about physical reality that don't translate well to written description. The force of air at altitude and airspeed is not the wind you know from standing outside on a winter day. It is not even the wind you know from driving on a highway with the window down. At 25,000 feet, flying at 160 miles per hour indicated airspeed, which translates to a much higher true airspeed at that altitude. The wind that rushed into the destroyed nose section of the B-17 was a physical assault of almost incomprehensible violence. It hit the navigator first. He had survived the cannon fire. By some miracle of geometry, the shells had destroyed the bombardier's position and the nose itself without taking him directly. But now the wind was on him, a force that slammed into his body and threatened to rip him free of the aircraft entirely, that stripped heat from his exposed skin in seconds, that turned the already brutal cold of high altitude into something that was no longer merely weather but active, immediate mortal danger. At 25,000 feet, without a pressure suit, with the nose of the aircraft open to the atmosphere, exposed skin begins losing sensation within seconds. Frostbite begins within minutes. The human body at these temperatures and altitudes is not fighting for comfort. It is fighting for consciousness. The navigator grabbed whatever he could reach. He pressed himself back against the forward bulkhead and held on, because the alternative was being sucked out of the opening where the nose had been. In the cockpit, just after the nose section, the pilot and co-pilot knew immediately that something catastrophic had happened. The aircraft shuddered. Warning lights flared. The airspeed indicator, the altimeter, some instruments had gone dark, their connections severed in the explosion. And the controls, the yoke and rudder pedals, that normally gave the pilot authority over his aircraft through hydraulic and cable systems, had changed in their feel. They were still there. The aircraft was still responding. But something was wrong with how they felt. What had happened to the control cables in the nose was something they couldn't yet know. The cannon fire had not completely severed all of the cables. The B-17's control systems were deliberately redundant, running along different paths through the airframe precisely because designers knew combat would damage them. But the blast had torn away the protective conduit and fairings along portions of the cable runs, leaving bare wire in some sections, stretched or kink cable in others. The pilots were, in effect, flying the aircraft on raw cables. The yoke moved. The aircraft responded. But any hard input, any sharp control movement, and they risked finishing what the Focke-Wulf had started, snapping a cable, losing control authority, turning a damaged aircraft into an uncontrollable one. They had to fly it home. They had to fly it gently, carefully, precisely, with damaged controls, a destroyed nose, a dead crewman, and the brutal cold tearing into the forward section of the aircraft. But what they didn't know yet, what was about to make everything exponentially worse, was that they were still over Germany, still 40 minutes from the Dutch coast, with the Luftwaffe still in the air around them, and a formation they were now falling behind, because maintaining formation speed with the destroyed nose and the aerodynamic drag of that gaping wound in the aircraft's front was becoming impossible. They were starting to fall back. A B-17 that falls behind its formation does not simply have a harder time of it. A B-17 that falls behind its formation becomes, in the language of fighter pilots and operational experience, a kill waiting to happen. The German fighter controllers on the ground tracked the formations by radar and by visual reports from ground observers. They could see straggling aircraft. They could vector pilots directly to them. A lone, damaged B-17, falling behind the formation, trailing smoke or with visible structural damage, was what the Germans called a Abschuss, a shoot down, that hadn't happened yet. The pilot understood this. Every man on that aircraft understood this, without it needing to be said. The interphone, The internal communication system was still partially functioning, though the noise of wind rushing through the destroyed nose section made communication difficult. Voices came through distorted, fragmentary, but they could still talk to each other, which meant they were still a crew. The pilot told them what they had. He told them the nose was gone. He told them the bombardier was dead. He told them the controls were damaged but responsive. And he told them they were going to fly home. He did not tell them he thought this was possible. He told them they were going to do it because there was no alternative, because the only other options were to bail out over Germany, into captivity, or worse, or to die in the aircraft. And he was not prepared to accept either of those. The co-pilot was working beside him, both men with their hands on the controls now. Not because two men flying the same aircraft is standard practice, but because the damaged cable systems meant that any sudden control requirement might demand more force than one man could provide. They had developed, in those first terrible minutes after the hit, an unspoken physical communication, each feeling what the other was doing, coordinating without words, sharing the airplane. Aft of them, the crew was dealing with their own emergencies. The cold was the most immediate. The destroyed nose was acting like a bellows, the ram air pressure of flight forcing frigid outside air through the opening and back through the forward sections of the aircraft. The cockpit, normally protected by the nose section ahead of it, was now partially exposed to the blast. The temperature in the cockpit was approaching the outside air temperature, which at 25,000 feet in winter was somewhere around minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The flight engineer, standing in the top turret position just behind the cockpit, had already identified several additional problems. One of the engines was running rough. Whether from battle damage or the shock of the explosion, it was impossible to know. Without a closer inspection, they couldn't make in the air. The oil pressure on the number 2 engine was dropping, slowly but perceptibly. He reported this to the pilot in the flat, controlled voice that training produces, the voice that communicates information without permitting itself the luxury of panic. They were losing an engine. Not yet. The engine was still running, still producing power. But the trajectory was clear. They were going to lose it. And when they did, on a damaged aircraft already fighting aerodynamic penalties from the destroyed nose, they would lose airspeed. And when they lost airspeed, they would lose altitude. And when they lost altitude, they would fall further behind the formation. And that was when the radio operator reported that he was picking up garbled transmissions he couldn't fully decode, but that his instinct, built on months of listening to the patterns of combat communication, told him there were fighters in the area. Of course there were. There is a kind of time that exists in extreme danger that has no relationship to the mechanical measurement of seconds and minutes. Survivors of aerial combat describe it consistently. Moments that stretched, experiences that seemed to last far longer than they could possibly have lasted by the clock, an altered consciousness in which perception becomes hyperacute, in which the mind processes information with an almost inhuman efficiency, stripping away everything irrelevant, focusing entirely on the thing that determined survival. The pilot was in that time now. He could feel the aircraft through the controls the way a surgeon feels through an instrument. Not just the gross movement, but the subtle messages the damaged systems were sending. The way the cable tension changed when he pushed or pulled beyond certain deflections. The vibration in the yoke that told him the control surfaces were working but under stress. He was not thinking about the bombardier. He could not afford to think about the bombardier. That was a grief that belonged to later, if there was a later. Right now the bombardier was a weight and mass consideration. The aircraft's trim had changed slightly with the redistribution of weight in the destroyed nose section, and the pilot had to account for that in his control inputs. He was not thinking about his own fear. Fear was there. He would acknowledge later that it was there, but in the moment it was not accessible, not in a way that affected his hands. His hands were steady. The aircraft was flying. The co-pilot called out a fighter. High at 2 o'clock. The pilot didn't move the controls sharply. He couldn't. He banked the aircraft as gently as he dared, a shallow turn that used the minimum control input that would accomplish the maneuver, watching the control forces as he moved the yoke, feeling for the point where the cables would protest. The gunners had the fighter. The top turret was tracking. The ball turret was rotating. The fighter, a Focke-Wulf 190, one of the best fighter aircraft in the world at that moment in history, Made a pass. It was probing. The German pilot assessing the situation. He could see the destroyed nose. He knew he had a crippled aircraft. He would make his decision about how to attack based on what the American pilot did in the next few seconds. The tail gunner opened fire. Long burst, tracers arcing. Not to hit. The fighter was still at the edge of range, but to communicate. To say, we are still here. We still have guns. You come for us, and we will shoot back. The fighter broke away. For the moment, the pilot checked his watch. He did not look at it and find comfort. He looked at it and performed the mathematics of survival. Distance to the Dutch coast. Current airspeed, reduced from nominal. Time remaining over Germany. 10 minutes. Approximately 10 minutes before they crossed out of German airspace, before they were over the relative safety of the North Sea, before the arithmetic of their survival shifted even slightly in their favor. 10 minutes pulling bare cables. 10 minutes with a dead man in the ruins of the nose below them. 10 minutes with a dying engine and the cold making every action slower, harder, more painful. 10 minutes. The number 2 engine gave up somewhere in the 8th minute. Not dramatically. Not in fire or explosion. That would come later, in other stories, on other aircraft. This engine simply lost oil pressure to a point where continued operation would destroy it. And the flight engineer told the pilot. And the pilot reached for the feathering switch, and the propeller blades on the number 2 engine rotated edge-on to the wind and stopped turning. And suddenly the aircraft was flying on 3 engines, and the aerodynamic asymmetry of that, the thrust from the right side now unbalanced, required rudder correction that loaded the rudder cables in a way that made the pilot's jaw tighten, because he could feel the cable system protesting. He held it. He kept the ball of the turn-in bank indicator centered. He kept the wings approximately level. The aircraft was losing altitude. Not catastrophically. A few hundred feet per minute. But over 10 minutes, that was going to be significant. And they were already below the formation. The co-pilot called out something, and the pilot followed his gesture and saw the fighters. Not one this time. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s, positioned at 10 o'clock low, flying parallel to the B-17's course, pacing them, and that was a bad sign. German fighter pilots didn't pace a target without purpose. They were watching, waiting, assessing whether the aircraft was going to fall further, slow further, become an easier kill with each passing minute. The tail gunner and the waist gunners could see them. The top turret tracked between targets. The pilot did something then that required a calculation he made without conscious deliberation. In the space of an instant, he pushed the throttles forward on the 3 remaining engines. More power, more speed. The cost was fuel burn and the additional stress on engines that had already flown hours, but the benefit was airspeed, and airspeed was life. If he could keep the aircraft from slowing, from falling further behind, he preserved the marginal protection of still being relatively close to the formation, and he communicated to the German pilots watching him that this aircraft had not given up. The aircraft's speed stabilized. The fighters watched for another 60 seconds. Then they peeled away. Not because they were driven off. Not because the American gunners had hit them. Because the German pilots had made a calculation of their own, fuel, range, the time remaining in the engagement, the other targets available, and had decided this particular kill was not worth the additional cost. The aircraft held its altitude. The Dutch coast appeared in the haze ahead. Crossing the coast didn't make them safe. It made them safer, which was a different and more modest thing. The North Sea in winter was its own kind of hostile, a forced bailout over that gray water, and that temperature, without a surface vessel to retrieve you within minutes, was a death sentence as certain as a cannon shell. But there were no Focke-Wulfs over the North Sea. The immediate, acute threat of the fighter had passed. The crew began, cautiously, to breathe. The pilot did not relax. Relaxation was a luxury he could not afford until the wheels were on the ground. He had a 3-engine aircraft with a destroyed nose section and damaged controls, and he had to land it. And landing a B-17 under normal circumstances was a skilled operation, and nothing about their circumstances was normal. The navigator, who had spent the entire flight back pressed against the forward bulkhead, in the ruins of the nose, exposed to temperatures and wind that should have incapacitated him, somehow transmitted a heading. His instruments had been partially destroyed with the nose, but he had maintained enough, a compass, his charts, his knowledge of the route, to give the pilot something to work with. How he had retained the cognitive function to do that, in that cold, in that wind, is a question that belongs to physiology and to whatever reserves of human determination are not reducible to physiology. He told the pilot where they were. He told them the heading for England. He told them they were going to make it. The pilot trusted him. There was nothing else to do but trust him. The English coast appeared from the sea haze with a particular quality that many B-17 crews described, not simply as land, but as the most beautiful sight available to the human eye after hours of sky over Germany. Green fields and brown earth, and the gray threads of roads and rivers, ordinary and civilian and alive. England. They called ahead. The radio operator, working despite the noise and the cold, had established intermittent contact with the airfield at Thorpe Abbotts. He told them what they had. Destroyed nose. One engine out. Crew casualties. Damaged controls. The control tower cleared the field. Landing a B-17 under these conditions required the pilot to make a series of decisions, each dependent on the ones before it, each one potentially the last decision he would need to make. The flaps, with the flap system partially damaged, extend uniformly, or would asymmetric flap extension create a roll he couldn't control with damaged cables? The landing gear, would it come down and lock? The approach. How much control authority did he actually have at lower speeds, where control surfaces became less effective? He worked through these questions not aloud, not dramatically, but methodically. He talked to the co-pilot. He talked to the flight engineer. They configured the aircraft for landing, each step taken with the care of men defusing something, which in a sense they were. The flaps came down, both sides, symmetric. The landing gear came down and locked. The aircraft slowed. The controls became heavier, less responsive, as the aerodynamic forces on the surfaces reduced. He could feel the cable system working at the edge of its integrity. He held the aircraft in a long, steady approach, keeping his airspeed as high as he safely could, delaying the slowest, most demanding phase of flight until the absolute last moment. The runway came up beneath him. He held off. He let the aircraft settle. And then the wheels touched, harder than he wanted. A thump that sent a shudder through the aircraft, but controlled, deliberate, survivable. And the B-17 rolled down the runway at Thorpe Abbotts and came to a stop, and for a moment nobody in the aircraft moved. Then the noise started. Not celebration. The men of the 8th Air Force did not, as a general rule, whoop and cheer after missions. What came was something quieter, more private, the specific sound of men who have been holding themselves together for hours beginning, carefully, to release. The ground crew who ran to the aircraft would remember the silence that came from inside it, the way the men climbed down slowly, carefully, like men who have been somewhere the body isn't designed to go and need time to return. The navigator had to be helped out. He had been in the exposed nose section, in temperatures around minus 40 degrees, in 160-mile-per-hour wind, for the better part of an hour. That he was alive was itself a fact that defied easy explanation. That he was conscious and had navigated them home belonged to a category of human performance that the word remarkable does not adequately contain. The bombardier's body was recovered from the wreckage of the nose section. He was 19 years old. What happened to this crew was not unique in the specific mechanisms of its horror. The 8th Air Force's combat records from 1943 contain accounts of aircraft that flew home, with engines out, with control surfaces destroyed, with crew members dead at their stations, with holes in the fuselage large enough to stand in. The particular texture of aerial combat in World War II generated an ongoing production of impossible situations that men somehow survived, or didn't, with a terrible regularity. But this story matters because of what it illustrates about the thing that air power theorists and military historians can measure in sorties and bomb tonnage and industrial disruption, but can never fully account for in those measurements. It illustrates what it cost. Every aircraft that appeared in those formations over Germany represented 10 men who had decided, or had been decided for by the machinery of war, to be there. Every mission was a series of individual confrontations with death, played out simultaneously across hundreds of aircraft and thousands of men. Each crew in their own aircraft dealing with their own emergencies, their own fear, their own version of what it means to hold a machine together with your bare hands at the edge of the sky. The bombardiers who lay over their northern sights were 20 years old, often younger. The navigators who held positions with frostbitten hands and fogged over charts were not much older. The pilots who flew three-engine, cable-bear aircraft across the North Sea had completed accelerated training programs that had compressed years of flying experience into months, because there wasn't time for more. They were ordinary men in the precise sense that they had been ordinary before the war. Students, clerks, farmhands, mechanics. The war had not transformed them into a different species. It had placed ordinary men in extraordinary circumstances and allowed the full, often astonishing scope of human capacity to manifest itself. Not always, not in every case, but often enough. Often enough that those German industrial targets were bombed. Often enough that the formations kept flying east, mission after mission, through 1943 and into 1944, and eventually to the end of the war in Europe. The 100th Bombardment Group flew its last combat mission in April 1945. By then, over 800 men from the Bloody 100th had been killed. Another 1,000 had been taken prisoner. The aircraft they had flown in, the B-17s that had carried them across the Channel and back again, had accumulated battle damage that would have been considered catastrophic in any peacetime context, and had been patched and repaired and sent back into the air because there was always another mission. The navigator from our story, if he survived the war, as some did, as many did not, would have carried with him for the rest of his life the specific, embodied memory of that hour in the destroyed nose, not as drama, not as heroism, as fact, as something that had happened to him that could not be fully communicated to anyone who had not been there, in that wind, at that altitude, holding on. That is the private cost that the public history of air power doesn't fully account for. The cost measured not in aircraft production figures or bombing accuracy statistics or target damage assessments, but in the interior experience of the men who flew the missions. What it felt like to climb into an aircraft at Thorpe Abbotts on a dark morning in 1943 and know, from the available statistics, from the evidence of empty bunks in the barracks, that you might not be coming back. What it felt like to keep climbing it anyway. There is a kind of courage that announces itself, that is performed in full view of witnesses and recorded and commemorated. And there is a quieter kind, the courage of simply continuing to do what must be done, in the cold and the noise, and the very specific and concrete danger, with damaged equipment and dead friends, and the knowledge that nobody is coming to help you. The men of the 8th Air Force knew that second kind of courage more intimately than the first. In the decades after the war, the B-17 Flying Fortress became a symbol. It appeared in films and books, in museums where restored aircraft gleam under fluorescent lights, while schoolchildren walk beneath their wings, and the symbol it became was of technological achievement, of Allied industrial supremacy, of the capacity of American manufacturing to produce machines of war in quantities that ultimately overwhelmed the enemy. All of that is true. But the machines were always secondary to the men inside them. The B-17 was magnificent. It was also brutal, cold, terrifying, and for a period in 1943, it was asking its crews to do something that sat very close to the edge of the possible. The technology was extraordinary. The human beings who climbed inside it and flew it into the concentrated defensive fire of the Luftwaffe were what made it work. When you see a photograph of a B-17 in flight, that elegant, powerful shape against the clouds, the 4 engines pulling it forward, the turrets bristling from its body, remember that inside it are 10 men, and that some of them are very young, and that they are cold, and they are afraid, and they are flying towards something that wants to kill them, and they are going anyway. Remember the man in the nose, the one who lay over his bomb site and held his aircrafts heading through the flak with the specific, trained, human steadiness that no machine could replicate. Remember the navigator who held on in the wind at the edge of the world and brought his crew home. Remember the pilot who flew bare cables with steady hands. They are worth remembering, not because they were exceptional, but because they were ordinary, and because when the moment came, They found in themselves something that none of them had known was there until it was the only thing standing between them and the sky. The wind hit at 300 miles per hour, and they flew home anyway.